So now we're going to spend some time looking at what the difference is between direct and indirect characterization and why an author would choose to use one or the other. So ultimately, direct characterization is when a character is described by an author and the author comes right out and directly tells you the type of character that that character is. So they may tell you that your character is greedy, or your character is rude, or your character is unliked by other people. They come right out and they just tell you. So direct characterization, there's no guessing, there's no inference. They just kind of come right out and do it. Indirect characterization is when an author uses the steal method. So the author's speech, excuse me, the character's speech, thoughts, effect on others, actions, or looks, and they kind of indirectly hint at the type of character that that character is. Or they may give you hints about what is motivating that character, or what that character is thinking or feeling, or how they are acting. And they're showing you the type of character it is, but you have to be a good reader to pick up those hints. And you have to make what's called an inference, which is an educated guess. So let's look at this example. What type of indirect characterization, according to the steal method, is being used in this example? Is it speech, thoughts, effect on others, action, or looks? If you guess that it was effect on others, you guess correctly. While this is also speech, ultimately it helps to show us how a character is being seen by others. So you might have identified speech, you might also have identified effect on others. Sometimes one example of characterization, indirect characterization, can be more than one method from the steal method. How about this one? Which element of the steal method of characterization is being used? Keep in mind I did not repeat. If you chose looks, you are correct. The author is telling us how this character looks as a way to start to build the character. How about this example? What do we learn about Ashley? Which method of characterization from the steal method of characterization is being used here? If you chose thoughts, T, you chose correctly. Oh, all right, let's look at this one. What do we learn about Tony, and what method of characterization is being used here? If you chose actions, you chose correctly. We learned that he is a dishonest character based on what he does. How about this final example? Which method of the steal method of characterization is being used here? If you chose speech, you would be correct. But notice we also get a little bit of action in here too. So keep in mind there's two different elements. Pinching the new babysitter. So notice that also tells us she's a little bit of a brat. So let's look at these two examples, and I want you to think to yourself, is it an example of direct characterization or is it indirect characterization? And as you're doing that, I just want you to identify it, but I want you to be thinking about how you know it's direct versus indirect. Remember, if it's direct, the author comes right out and tells you the type of character you're dealing with. If it's indirect, they show you using the steal method of characterization. If you chose direct for A and indirect for B, you chose correctly. Let's try another about Luella. Okay, now notice in the first one, the author comes right out and tells us she doesn't like school. In the second item, or the second passage, the author shows us through multiple elements of the steal method of characterization. They show us through indirect characterization. You might be noticing that indirect characterization is usually a little bit longer and meatier. It takes more sentences. It takes more time to show versus tell, but you very often get better information about a character. Let's look at this one. Which one is direct and which one's indirect? And how do you know? Again, the first example is longer. There's multiple methods of Steele method of characterization, right? Actions, there's speech in there, there's reactions in there. So S, the A, the E for effect. And notice in the second one, the author just comes right out and tells you that Joey's sad. All right, so we're going to look at these two examples about Jane. Both of these examples are going to tell us how she's such a beautiful girl and how she stands out from other people. But what I want you to be thinking about is, what is the difference between these two examples of characterization? How are they different from one another? They both say the same thing ultimately. And which one gives you more information about our character? If you guessed the second item, you'd be right. In that item, we do find out that she's beautiful, but we find out more about her. We find out, that she's stunning, which is a more powerful word than beautiful, that she commands attention wherever she goes. We get more information through the author's development indirectly. Now, let's look at this example, and we're going to try it again. Look at the example about Jim, and I want you to think about, what is the difference between the information that the author is giving us in these two methods? If you guessed that in the first item, it is indirect characterization, and the author is hinting at the fact that he is a better and more honest and truthful man, then you would be correct. They go a little bit further to kind of compare him to other people. Whereas in the second example, the author just comes right out and tells us. So notice, indirect characterization may take more time, it may take more work, it may involve a lot of different elements of the Steele method of characterization. But ultimately, indirect characterization is going to be much more effective because it's going to give us more overall information about the type of character we have in our story, about our character's motivation, about our character's backstory, about our character's conflict, about our character's thoughts and temperaments. We're going to learn more that way, and we're going to have a more interesting story if we have to make inferences versus if we're constantly told. Stories can get very boring. So let's look at these two examples, and I want you to think about exactly what makes the first example direct characterization. How do you know it's direct characterization? Tell me in your own words. Now, let's look at the second example, and I want you to lift one part of either a full sentence or a part of a sentence from that second example that shows you that it's indirect characterization. Just a hint. Think about the Steele method of characterization. Do you see any elements of the Steele method of characterization? If you do, that's how it's indirect characterization, because Steele is only for indirect characterization. All right, now let's look at these examples. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take each of these methods of direct characterization. I'd like you to look at them, and I'd like you to choose one example of direct characterization. So you could choose about Mr. Bird, Kyle, Tom, or Allie. And what I want you to do is I want you to use the Steele method of characterization, and I want you to add 2 or 3 sentences to this example, and I want you to turn it into indirect characterization. So instead of just telling us that the character was really close to them, or that the character was the smallest of them all, whatever, I want you to show me using indirect characterization. All right, so these might be some examples of indirect characterization that you might have used. Take a moment and just look at the differences between the first example and the second. All right, now we're going to do the opposite. So I gave you indirect characterization, where you have to infer. We use the Steele method of characterization. We get a lot of extra details. There's 4 different examples here. I want you to go through each one And I want you to write a sentence using direct characterization that tells me, based on this indirect characterization that I gave you, I want you to tell me what type of character Lou and Judy and Arnold and Miss Monte are. So what I want you to do now, sorry if I'm repeating myself, my video cut off briefly, is I want you to take each of these 4 items of indirect characterization, where the author used the Steele method, and I want you to rewrite it using direct characterization. When we do that, what we basically are going to do is we're going to use what the text says, and we're going to write a statement about the type of character that Lou, Judy, Arnold, and Mrs. Monte are. So you may just take what it says in the text and tell me the type of character it is versus these examples, which is showing me. So you might have written something like, Lou is an amazing musician, or Judy really is such a wonderful friend, or Arnold is a total klutz, or Mrs. Monte is the most unorganized lady. Notice how it's so much more direct, it's so much more succinct or simple, and the author comes right out and just tells us. So we tried to go both ways to look at the 2 examples. For the last part today, I want you to go back to the worksheet where you did your notes on the Steele method of characterization and the difference between indirect and direct characterization. And I want you to fill in the bottom portion of the first page, part 2 of the indirect and direct worksheet on characterization. This will be your exit ticket today. If you finish before the rest of your classmates, please read your AR book, or you can go into iReady.